Hi again then guys, and welcome to another car review, of course from Gran Turismo's 1.45 selection, and this time we are moving on to by far the most expensive car of the pack, and the car which has definitely had the biggest price hike of the pack as well, the Corvette Stingray Racer concept from 1959, keeping in the trend of American cars, for now at least in this update, and of course rounding it out with an Italian, the Ferrari tomorrow. But as far as this one goes, it's a car which has actually completely changed series on the channel. This used to be in days gone by. Back when I reviewed it in Gran Turismo 6, it was actually one of the fastest classic cars in the game. You could do like 280 miles an hour in it, crazy fast. Now though, because of the drastic price change, it's a high roller. 5 million credits. That's a whole lot of cash. Now, some people were annoyed by that, and I could understand why. A lot of people don't like grinding for money, for instance, in GT Sport. I get it from that point of view, but I've actually come to the conclusion now and got to the point where I quite like working for certain cars. Now, would I choose to spend like 10, 15, 20 million on something like this? No, absolutely not. But 5 million, that's actually not too bad. It doesn't take very long to earn 5 million as long as you're willing to do a bit of grinding, be it on the Red Bull events, Monza event, Blue Moon Bay, of course. You can earn that pretty fast, quite comfortably within a day, in fact, if you've got a couple of hours to spare. Now, as far as this car's performance goes, it belies its spec because it's an American car from the 50s, and yet a lot of the numbers aren't necessarily that impressive. The power, the torque, both pretty low, the weight is not particularly high, and of course that's not a bad thing, but again, 50s America isn't exactly thought of as being lightweight, generally speaking, and the price tag of course being 5 million means it's got quite a lot to live up to for those who do buy it and maybe aren't a super fan of the Corvette, for instance. Because if you are a Corvette collector or a high roller aficionado, let's be honest, those of us who are, we don't really care if the car's good or not. It's more about the collector's aspect, and then if you can use it to race with, it's kind of just a bonus at that point. So with that in mind, what does this offer and what can it do? Well, the engine capacity, once again, in a weird way like the Camaro, is not listed in the game, but what is listed is the power, which is only 314 brake horsepower, the torque, which is an even lower 289 pound-feet, like I said, surprisingly low numbers for an American car, but the weight is low as well. 1150 kilos is very healthy. Now, of course, it's a racer concept, so it's not like this big Coronet muscle car or the even bigger Camaro. Of course, totally different kind of American classic. But in terms of performance, this car is actually much more akin to some of the very expensive European race cars of the classic era, or even vintage era. Stuff like the Aston Martin DB3S, for instance, actually handles in a fairly similar way to this one. Now, the main advantage that this car has, especially for its age, is the aerodynamics. And because of the aerodynamics, it being very low and very wide in comparison to a lot of others, just look at the Jag D-Type for instance, look at the aforementioned Aston Martin, they're quite tall and they're not overly wide. So although they're fantastic in a straight line, the Jag in particular, they're a bit wobbly through corners. And although you can win races with them, of course against other vintage cars, classics in general, they don't really have a huge amount of range beyond that. As soon as you put it up against a modern machine, you start to struggle quite quickly. In fact, there are some cars that have, on occasion, power that doesn't even eclipse a classic race car, but can still beat it, even like a production car. This, however, has more of a modern sports car kind of stance. It's wide, it's low, not overly long, but long-ish, and so through corners, for instance, it's actually got fairly minimal body roll, and if you lower the suspension, stiffen it up a bit, you can improve that even more. Now, to address what is almost always the elephant in the room when it comes to these high rollers, yes, it is unfortunately in Group X, although at this point, there are arguably enough of these cars in Group X for it to not matter as much as it used to. If you've been playing the game for long enough to remember when stuff like the Jaguar XJ13 and the Ferrari P4 came along, it was a big deal back then, because we weren't expecting it, and it was very disappointing. Now, however, there are quite a few of them there, and at least you've got certain events that you can use them in now. Of course, you can use them in lobbies, so there's more use, put simply. So Group X isn't as bad as it used to be for cars like this. Other ones still annoy me, of course the inconsistency of the class as a whole, but as far as high rollers go, it's in good company, at least. Now, as far as the performance, of course the top speed is nowhere near what it used to be. It was crazy fast in GT6, but in terms of all-round ability, it's very good. In fact, this is one of those cars which really belies its age. It easily can perform as well as a car that's a decade or two newer in those kind of classic racing fields or lobbies, if you will. It's a car which doesn't do the work for you by any means, but at the same time, if you are less experienced at driving classic or vintage race cars, this might be a good place to start, because the handling is better than most, and although it's still kind of like driving a little flying saucer with wheels, as I said in my review of the patch as a whole, that's still not necessarily a bad thing. It's just different to a modern car. And I would actually argue that if you purchase a Stingray Racer in GT Sport and learn how to use it well, get it under control, learn how these kind of classic racers handle in terms of the wallowy suspension, the more dull steering in some cases compared to a modern car, the more boat-ish elements to it. If you can use that and get used to it and become proficient in it, then this is a good way to start getting into that. You start with something like this, you end up driving XJ13s, Ferrari P4s, etc., and doing really well with them, because some of those cars actually feel much more akin to a modern day prototype in some cases, especially the Ferrari P4. It's so lightweight and so similar to a prototype that's 10, 20, 30 years newer that although of course it's not as quick, you can definitely feel that lineage there. With something like this, it's so old school that it doesn't feel like that at all. It's much more of a GT style car, and so its rivals, I would say, in the game could easily be stuff like the DB3S, the D-Type, I mean those aerodynamic old school shapes of course, but even stuff like the 250 GTO, or the 250 Berlinetta, or maybe even something like an Alpha TZ2, that kind of more GT style body with less power but also not overly heavy. That's the kind of rivalry that this car does well with. Don't necessarily try and take on a P4 or an XJ13 with it, because although you could win, maybe, against the AI, you're going to struggle in a lobby, because those cars are basically supercars in comparison to the sports car that is this one. And ultimately, as far as my thoughts on the Stingray Racer go as a high roller now, rather than just a classic, are pretty similar actually to my thoughts on a lot of the high rollers, and that is, I definitely would not suggest that everyone buys one, because they're not for everyone. They do have worse handling, they're slower, they're very expensive, they take a long time to get, and you have to like classic cars if you're going to like these. So if you're completely new to being maybe a collector, maybe a classic enthusiast, maybe try something that's a bit cheaper first, and if you enjoy those, you know, like the Countach, the Ferrari 365, that kind of stuff, try those out first. Maybe some that are kind of expensive but not ridiculously expensive. Get yourself a Pantera, for instance. If you like the way that handles and like the vibe, then go for something that's more expensive like this one in the long run. It certainly gives you something to work towards as far as cash, and it's a nice car to show off in lobbies as well. And for a Corvette fan, of course, it's an important piece of the history, and again, it is a car that I predicted would come back to the game, and it certainly has. But overall, that's it for my thoughts on the Stingray Racer. Of course, stick around on the channel for the final review tomorrow of the Ferrari from the pack. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.